The wind came hard off the northern ridge, carrying dust and frost in a long, low sweep through the street of Dry Creek. It cut between leaning buildings like a knife through brittle wood, rattling loose shutters and setting porch boards to groaning. Somewhere a sign banged softly against a post. The air was sharp enough to make a man's lungs ache, but it wasn't the cold that made the street go still. It was the sound, high and sudden, the crack of leather biting flesh. It struck again, louder this time, echoing against the saloon's walls before the wind took it away. A man stood in the porch's yellow spill of light, arm rising and falling, each swing punctuated by a curse. The woman took the blows without a cry, her body bent slightly forward, as if bracing against rain. 3 small girls stood barefoot in the frozen mud behind her, clutching each other so tightly it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. The youngest's lip was trembling, but her eyes were locked on her mother's back. The town watched from its pockets of shadow. Men leaned against posts, half hidden, their breath making pale ghosts in the cold. Nobody moved. The buildings pressed in on either side like gossiping old men, their peeling boards and warped roofs seeming to listen, not speak. The saloon door swung once, letting a stronger wash of whiskey and smoke into the street before it settled closed again. Horses tied along the rail stamped the frozen ground, steam rising from their nostrils in thick bursts. She was small, thin enough for the bones of her wrists to show above the frayed edges of her sleeves. A calico dress, faded to the color of dust, hung loose on her frame, torn open along one shoulder where the strap had caught. Her hair was long and unkempt, strands sticking in the cold sweat on her temple. When the leather came down, she did not flinch or raise her arms to block it. Her hand moved only to reach back, trembling but firm, to keep the girls behind her. No one called her name. In that moment, she had none, not here. At the far end of the porch, a man sat alone, shoulders hunched slightly against the wind. His hat brim was pulled low, shadowing eyes that had learned not to show much. He held a tin mug in both hands, though the steam from it had long since gone. His coat was rough-worn, it seems darkened by years of weather and dust, his boots scuffed and cracked at the toes. When he shifted the cup, the hand beneath it was missing 2 fingers, the skin puckered and pale where they should have been. The wound was old, from a war this town no longer remembered. The man doing the beating was a freight driver, his thick frame filling the saloon's doorway, his voice loud enough to carry over the wind. He called her useless, spat the words with the same venom as his tobacco, said all she'd given him with 3 useless girls, and not a son worth the salt to feed him. His face was red, not from cold but from the heat of his own cruelty. The onlookers kept their eyes down, boots shifting in the dirt, but none stepped forward. Dry Creek had long since made its peace with quiet cruelty. The rancher on the porch did not rise. His jaw moved slow, grinding, as though each word and blow were stones in his mouth. He watched. The cold wind tugged at his coat, rattled the loose board under his boot heel, but still he did not move. When the freight driver's arm finally fell still, he shoved her hard, sending her stumbling off the porch into the street. One girl slipped in the mud, and the mother pulled her close with the others before straightening, her breath quick and white in the fading light. For a moment, the youngest girl looked up from where she stood pressed against her mother's leg. Her eyes were dark, steady, not pleading, not afraid, but fixed. They found the man at the far end of the porch. The brim of his hat hid most of his face, but something in his stillness seemed to meet her gaze head-on. He set the tin mug down on the rail, the hollow clink carrying through the quiet. The wind picked up again, rattling the porch boards under his boots. He stood, his height casting a longer shadow across the saloon's wall. The moment broke without a word. The freight driver turned his back, muttering something lost to the wind, and disappeared inside the saloon. The door swung once more, spilling light and the low hum of voices before shutting tight. The woman shifted her sack of belongings higher on her shoulder, gathered her girls closer, and started toward the dark stretch of road that led out of town. The cold pressed in around them, the mud sucking at their bare feet as they went, their figures growing smaller until the wind and the street swallowed them. The rancher stayed where he was, his gaze lingering on the place where the wind had smoothed over their footprints. Then he turned, stepped off the porch into the cold, and crossed the street toward his horse. The sound of his spurs, faint and steady, was the only thing moving in Dry Creek until the wind rose again. Snow began to fall in thin, wandering flakes, the kind that seemed too fragile to survive the air, melting into the dirt the moment they landed. The woman limped along the edge of the street, her girls close to her side, each step slow with weariness. A torn flower sack hung from her shoulder, its faded fabric straining around a meager bundle of belongings. The youngest clung to the hem of her dress, the middle one carried a chipped tin cup, and the oldest kept her head down, scanning the road ahead as if willing it to shorten. The rancher was in the livery yard, his hands moving without thought as he tightened the cinch on his mare. He led the animal out into the street, swung into the saddle, and turned west. For a moment, as his horse's hooves thudded past the edge of town, he let his eyes drift over his shoulder. The sight of their small figures moving into the gray distance stayed in him longer than it should have. Then he pulled the brim of his hat lower and rode on. Days later, he came to the river crossing on the trail north. The water was swollen from an early thaw higher in the mountains, rushing in dark waves over the stones. The woman was there, knee-deep in the current, her skirts heavy and soaked, trying to guide a borrowed mule across. The girls clung to the animal's side, their faces pale from cold. The mule balked, sidestepping in panic, and the youngest lost her grip. She slipped sideways into the current, her small body vanishing under the churning water. Before the thought had even formed, he was in the river, his mare plunging into the cold surge. His arm reached down, fingers hooking the back of her dress, hauling her up as she coughed and choked against his shoulder. He set her on the muddy bank, her sisters scrambling to pull her close. He stripped the wool blanket from his saddle and wrapped it around her, the damp already seeping through her clothes. His eyes met the woman's for the briefest moment, no words passed, and then he mounted again, turned his horse into the trail, and rode away without looking back. That night, the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from the north. Riding the far edge of his pasture later in the week, he saw the old line shack that had been abandoned for years, its roof sagging like a tired back. A thin coil of smoke rose from the crooked chimney. He dismounted and pushed open the warped door. Inside, the woman and her girls crouched near a small fire built from splintered fence posts. The flames licked the blackened stones, their light catching the sharp hollows of her face. She did not rise, did not speak. Her eyes followed him as he stood there in the half-light. He glanced at the stripped pile of boards by the wall, then back at her. She didn't ask to stay. He didn't tell her to leave. They stood locked in a silence that said everything words couldn't carry, until he stepped back outside and closed the door against the wind. The freight driver came up the ranch road a few days later, sitting high in the saddle, his mouth already working before the horse had stopped. He said she'd run off with his mule, that she was his by debt. The rancher leaned against the corral fence, the post rough under his palm, a twist of tobacco resting in his cheek. He didn't answer. The driver's voice rose, demanding, threatening, trying to dig his words under the skin. The rancher's gaze stayed somewhere beyond the hills, calm and immovable. Finally, the driver cursed and pulled his reins, riding off in a spray of frost and dirt. The mare's hooves faded into the distance, but the smell of anger stayed in the air. By nightfall, whispers had started in town, quiet talk that the rancher had taken in trouble, and trouble would follow. The town's disapproval sat like an unseen weight. The few men who'd once nodded to him now kept their eyes on the ground. Women lingered on the boardwalk to watch him ride past, their conversations lowering to a murmur. But he went about his work as though the wind had simply changed direction. One late afternoon, the woman stepped into the general store, her girls huddled close to the stove, just inside the door. She carried a small silver hair comb, its teeth bent and dulled from use, and set it gently on the counter. Her voice was low when she asked for flour. The shopkeeper leaned forward, looking at her with a slow, curling smile. He said her kind wasn't worth the trouble, that breeding wrong was no way to earn a living. The words slid into the room like a blade. From the back of the store, the rancher stepped forward, His boots made a soft thud on the wooden floorboards, the rhythm unhurried but deliberate. He reached into his coat, drew out 2 coins, and set them on the counter with a metallic ring. He took the sack of flour himself and placed it in her arms, his gaze never touching the shopkeeper's face. The room held still. She looked at him, her eyes neither soft nor hardened, only searching. He gave no smile, no explanation. Then he turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving the scent of cold air in his wake. In a town like Dry Creek, an act like that was not forgotten. It was a stone dropped into still water. The ripples would find every shore. The sun was sinking low when the sound of hoofbeats drifted over the dry grass, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made the air feel heavier. Dust rose in thin veils as 3 riders came into view, one thick-shouldered man in a freight driver's vest, 2 others trailing behind like shadows. They drew up in front of the rancher's porch, the lead man tugging on the reins, his horse snorting at the scent of sweat and leather. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, fixing on the figure standing there with a rifle cradled loosely in both hands. Inside the house, behind a curtain that swayed faintly with the draft, 2 young faces watched, their breath caught somewhere between fear and fascination. Their mother stood back from the window, one hand pressed over her chest, her eyes locked on the man outside, the one who claimed she belonged to him by debt. The freight driver's voice was rough, carrying over the brittle air. "She owes me. You know it, I know it. Time's come to settle it." His words fell heavy, like rocks hitting dry earth. The rancher didn't move. The fading light cut across his face, showing neither anger nor fear, only a stillness that made the moment feel older than the men in it. The breeze stirred the loose hairs at his temple, rattled the porch boards under his boots. His eyes never left the freight driver's. "She's here now," he said, his voice low, steady, like a stone in a river. "She's under my roof. That makes her my honor." The freight driver's lips curled in a humorless smile. He leaned in his saddle, spat into the dirt, and let the silence hang for a moment too long. Then he wheeled his horse around, the others following, hooves drumming away into the dusk. They didn't look back, but the air they left behind felt charged, as if a storm had only just been delayed. Days passed, each one marked by an uneasy quiet. The girls played near the barn, but glanced toward the horizon more than they used to. The woman worked beside the rancher without speaking much, the air between them carrying a strange, new understanding. And then, before the first blush of dawn one morning, the smell of smoke woke him. It was thick and sharp, clinging to the back of the throat. He was out the door before the full shape of the danger reached him, bare feet pounding the frost-hardened ground. The barn was alive with fire, tongues of orange racing along its roof, devouring the dry timbers, with a hunger that roared louder than the wind. The woman was already there, skirts hitched, hauling bucket after bucket from the trough, her hair loose and wild in the firelight. She didn't wait for him to shout or direct. She moved like someone who'd been through worse, like someone who refused to let the animal scream inside without trying. He grabbed a length of rope, his eyes stinging, and ran into the heat. The horses thrashed in their stalls, eyes wide, whites flashing in the flickering glow. He cut them loose, pushing them toward the open air, each kick of their hooves sounding like gunshots. She kept running back and forth with water, her arms trembling, skirt cinched, and he met her halfway again and again until the roof caved inward with a roar. They stood back, panting, the cold morning air mingling with the blistering heat as the barn burned down to a black skeleton against the paling sky. When it was over, their hands were black with soot, their clothes damp and streaked with ash. They didn't speak. The surviving animals huddled together in the corral, their breath rising in clouds. In the window of the house, 2 small faces were pressed to the glass, eyes wide, not with fear, but with something else. They had never seen a man work beside their mother like that, not shouting at her, not striking her, but moving with her, trusting her strength. They didn't have words for it yet, but it settled deep inside them, a quiet seed. By the time the sun was high, the fire's acrid smell had carried to town. Word spread quickly in places where talk moved faster than wagons. It was in the store a few days later, while the rancher was buying nails and feed, that the freight driver tried again. The door swung open, and there he was, stepping in with his usual swagger, his voice pitched loud enough to pull every eye in the room. "Man's harboring a thief," he announced, his gaze fixed on the rancher. "She owes me more than she can pay, and he's standing in the way of a lawful claim." The room shifted, the way it does when something might turn ugly. Men leaned on counters, women paused at the shelves, the grocer's hand stilled halfway to the bin of potatoes. The rancher turned slowly, the woman standing beside him. She didn't shrink back. Her chin was lifted, her eyes steady. For a moment, the freight driver's voice filled the air like a bad smell. But when he looked around for agreement, the faces staring back at him were unreadable. No one moved to join him. The silence stretched, and in it, something unspoken passed between the townsfolk. The sight of the rancher standing there with the woman beside him had already shifted the balance. Whatever debts or old claims she'd carried here had been overwritten by what they'd seen. Her working beside him in the fire, him protecting her without asking for anything in return. The freight driver's grin faltered. He spat again, though it seemed more out of habit than satisfaction, and backed toward the door with a muttered curse. The bell above it jingled once, and then he was gone. The rancher paid for his nails and feed in the same calm way he always had. Outside, the sky was wide and bright, and the wind carried the scent of sage. The woman walked beside him without speaking, the air between them heavier with understanding than it had been the day she arrived. The girls would run to meet them when they got home, maybe asking if the driver would be back, maybe not. But the rancher already knew. Men like that didn't come back once the ground shifted under them. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the weight of a fight lift from his shoulders, leaving only the quiet knowledge that some stands were worth the cost, no matter the hour they came due. The freight driver was gone by the time the sun rose over Dry Creek, his wagon tracks fading into the hardpan as though the land itself wanted to forget him. No one watched him leave. No one cared enough to mark the hour. By the time the first smoke curled from the ranch's chimney, his shadow was nothing but a memory, carrying his debts with him into whatever corner of the territory would take him. Life settled into a quiet rhythm. The woman and her girls did not leave after the snow began to melt, though no agreement had been made and no promises spoken. They simply stayed, as if the place had been waiting for them. Morning chores were done shoulder to shoulder, hauling water, tending horses, splitting logs. Meals were shared at the same rough-hewn table, no seats assigned, no words about the arrangement. It was a life measured by the sound of tools on wood, the creak of leather harness, and the low murmur of voices around the hearth at night. One afternoon, when the air carried the first edge of spring, the rancher stood by the corral gate with a chisel and mallet. The wood was dry and sun-bleached, worn smooth by years of use. He worked without hurry, driving the steel edge into the grain, carving each line deep and true. When he stepped back, the shape was simple, 4 lines crossed by one. No initials, no name, just a mark that bound things together. Him, and the 3 girls now under his roof. She noticed it later, coming in from the chicken coop with her hands raw from gathering feed. Her fingers brushed the fresh grooves without thought, tracing the angles. The wood smelled sharp, the shavings still clinging at the edges. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The mark said more than words would have managed. By the time the thaw set in, the town had learned something new about the woman from the ranch. They didn't speak it outright. Dry Creek wasn't the kind of place for that, but people had stopped pretending they didn't see her. When she walked into the general store one mild morning, the bell over the door rang, as if nothing in the world had changed. Yet everything had. She carried a small leather pouch, with coins earned from selling eggs. The shopkeeper didn't hesitate, didn't reach for his ledger to mark down credit she would never see. He weighed her sugar and wrapped her flour, without a word, but there was no scorn in his eyes now. 2 men by the stove tipped their hats as she passed. It wasn't kindness. Not really. But it was a recognition that couldn't be taken back, that she belonged where she was, and no one could undo it. Back at the ranch, the season stretched toward its first green. Calves tested their legs in the pasture. The air carried the smell of damp earth, and the light lingered a little longer each day. She took to spending the evenings on the porch, hands resting on the rail as the land softened into shadow. The girls' laughter drifted from the yard where they chased each other, and the sound carried a peace that had been absent from their voices before. One evening, as the sky burned down to gold, the rancher was out by the fence line, hammer in hand, mending a section that winter's wind had loosened. The girls were there with him, handing nails from an old tin, their small hands dark with dust. His voice was low, patient, pointing out where the rails needed lifting, showing them how to check the wire's tension. It was work, but there was a kind of quiet joy in the way they moved together. When he was done, he walked back toward the house. The last of the sun caught on the brim of his hat, throwing his face into shadow. As he stepped up onto the porch, he passed close to her. His hand, rough and scarred from years of rope and wood and weather, reached up and closed gently over hers, where it rested on the rail. The gesture was simple, unhurried, but there was nothing casual in it. "You are my honor," he said, the words steady as the land beneath them. The wind stirred through the dry grass, carrying the scent of earth and rain yet to come. She didn't answer, not because she couldn't, but because the truth didn't need repeating. His hand lingered against hers for a moment more before he moved past her into the house. The screen door, whispering, shut behind him. She stayed there on the porch as the light bled away, the sound of the girls' voices softening into the hum of night. Somewhere out on the prairie, a lone coyote called, its cry long and low. The horizon held its last ember of red before surrendering to the dark. The mark on the corral gate stood out faintly in the gloom, for lines crossed by one, a sign cut deep enough to outlast them all. The wind moved again, bending the tall grass in slow waves, as if the land itself was breathing. And in that quiet, with the day folding into night, everything felt exactly where it belonged.